Today, even though we said that class would kind of gather for 10 minutes, and so we'd actually start about 10:10. I think we didn't get out of church at 10, so it'll take us a few more minutes to gather, I imagine. And thank you, Chuck, for sharing your resource with us for storytelling, because I've got a big story to tell today. And because we're recording these, I'm not going to do as much kind of recapping as I did last week. If you're in, if you feel like you need to go over something, or you weren't here last week or something like that, just check out the website, and you can find the lessons for each session online. And you don't have to bring the books to class each week, but you can. Like I said, it's your nickel, they're yours, and so you can and use them any way you want. Use them to reinforce what I talk about in the class, or to sort of prepare for what you're going to hear in class. Either way works, I think. The only thing that probably won't work is trying to follow along with what's in the book. It might be, might agree generally, because I will try to cover the subjects, but I can't guarantee that that won't go. We deviate sometimes, go off on. I always say that one of the books I had reread recently is Alice in Wonderland. And so I know that chasing rabbits can sometimes lead to interesting places, so we can always do that. But as what I did say last week, and as we are in what we're going to cover today is the second half of chapter 2, because last week I talked about the first half, which is the idea of revelation as God coming down in an event which is witnessed and recognized as important, and then told to others and handed on. And so today I want to tell the actual story. I think I also talked about the first thing that we learned from the event of Revelation, which for us is the death and resurrection of Jesus, is that we believe in God. And that God that we believe in is the same God that Jesus prayed to as the Father, and teaches us to pray to as our Father. And that God is not a new God, but the God who was revealed to the people of Israel as the Almighty of the Old Testament. And that the resurrection itself is not, although Paul says if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation, yet is not a new God. So the God who is the God of the new creation is also the God of heaven and earth, who created heaven and earth, and all that is visible and invisible, or seen and unseen. So that although this may be the death and resurrection of Jesus may be a new beginning, it is not a bolt out of the blue. It's not without its continuity and context. And that means that the people who were the disciples of Jesus and the very first Christians, and witnesses to Jesus' life and death and resurrection, were the people who already had a history as the people of Israel, and their story as told in the what we call the Old Testament. So I'll be referring to chapters or to books of the Old Testament, but this is not a course, this is not a Bible study kind of presentation. It's just a way of telling the story, because sometimes the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, I think gets a bad rap. And in fact, I think it's one of the great, this sounds trivial to say, but it is one of the great books of human achievement, or human literature, I suppose. In fact, I first encountered the Bible in a serious way when I was a senior in college and had a class in biblical literature, which was primarily the Old Testament, and learned to to appreciate it that way. So where to begin? How do we begin? Well, let's begin in the beginning. Because the very first chapter of the book of Genesis, which means beginning, is the phrase "in the beginning." In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, but God said, "Let there be light." And so the first chapter affirms, this is not a scientific account, needless to say, but it is an affirmation of the people of faith that God created the heavens and the earth by His word. If you compare the stories of creation myths among many peoples in the world, they'll read about turtles that laid an egg and gave birth to the world, or things like that. And the sort of simplicity and majesty, I think, of the first chapter of the book of Genesis is really remarkable. There's a great German scholar named Gerhard von Rad, who wrote a commentary on the book of Genesis. I think we've got it right up there. And he said that the first chapter of the book of Genesis, it's impossible to overestimate its theological depth and importance, because the statement that God, science talks about a Big Bang. The book of Genesis says, okay, who said bang?
Yeah.
Who said no? And there are actually two stories, though, of the creation. The first is sort of begins with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and goes through each sort of level of being. If you want to see what the picture of the world is in the first chapter of Genesis, it looks something like this. The earth was without form and void, tohu wabohu, plank time, if you think about it that way. It's just, and then God separates light from darkness. The light is uncreated light. It's not coming from the sun or anything like that. It's that I guess in the Big Bang would be the period. I'm not trying to correlate these things, by the way, but it would be that period of pure energy and light before the inflation, before the world, before atoms and all that. And so God separates the light from the darkness, and then He separates, because I'm going to show you the whole picture. The water, or the deep, is up here, and then when He creates the heavens, it's a dome. The Hebrew word means it's been something that's been hammered out, so it's a dome, and then the stars are all hung from this dome up here, and there's water beyond that, and then of course there's water under that, and then this is land. And then He creates plants. That's a plant. And then He creates animals, and then creeping things, and so forth. It makes perfect sense to me, because when the heavens open, water pours through, as we know from Ian, right?
Yeah.
And if you dig down, you get water too. So it's perfectly, makes much more sense than our vision of the world. The only trouble is, it's wrong scientifically, but it's right theologically. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. If you ever listen, does anybody know Haydn's Oratorio de Creation? It starts out with this sort of, almost sounds like, I don't know, Schoenberg or something, doesn't it, in the beginning? And then all of a sudden, when God said, "Let there be light," it's this piercing trumpet, that comes in. And the Genesis 1 ends with the, got to be careful I don't get too caught up in the story. We got to move through 3,000 years of history here. But in the first chapter of Genesis, it sort of culminates with the creation of humankind. The Hebrew word for humankind is Adam. So in Genesis 1, it says that God created humankind. The way Hebrew poetry works is not by rhyme or meter, the way English and European poetry works, but by what they call thought rhymes. So one word will rhyme, so to speak, with a word in the next verse, and that helps you to interpret it. So the earth is the Lord's, and all who dwell therein. I got my, for he has founded it upon the seas and established upon, I skipped it. What's the verse I'm thinking of? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. That's what I wanted. The earth and the fullness thereof. The world and all that dwell therein. So earth lines up with world. See how it works? And fullness thereof lines up with all who dwell therein. So in the case of the creation of humankind, it's God created humankind. In the image of God, he created them. So you have to line these up. Male and female, he created them. So what it means is that we are the image of God, which is why you can't have graven images of God, because God has created us in his image. So we're his image. The equality of male and female is established. We are both created in the image of God. There's no question of superiority or dominance of one gender over the other. But on the other hand, each of us as an individual is incomplete, is an incomplete image. So in order to see the whole image, you have to see humanity as a whole. And that's sort of the crown of creation, to use a phrase of the Jefferson Airplane.
You want me to tell my joke?
Oh, no, not now. Next one.
Okay.
Chapter 2. Chapter 2. Okay, then you can tell your joke. Okay, so in the second chapter of Genesis is a different way of telling us the same story in a sense. And this is, rather than theological statement, this is told in the language of myth. Now, a myth is not an untrue story. A myth is a story that is always true. In other words, what myth does is tells a truth in narrative form. And so in this, and so you have to learn how to kind of interpret it. And in this, the word for ground or dust in Hebrew is Adamah. Okay, so see what happens? So God creates Adam out of the Adamah. Remember, O man, dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. So remember, O human. So he creates Adam out of Adamah. And so human being, Adam, is made out of dust, made out of the earth, but is male and female together. One, and so then he brings all the animals to humankind, to Adam, to see if there would be a fit, so to speak, for him, and there isn't. And so he causes a sleep to come over him, and he takes a rib out and separates Adam, or male and female. Ish and Isha is a word for male and female. So he separates them out from each other. And this explains why we desire each other, because it's the desire for an original wholeness to be restored. Now, Betsy, you can tell your story.
Okay, so Adam's walking around the Garden of Eden and he's looking up and down and round and round, and he looks up at God and he says, God, what am I doing here? I'm so lonely. And God says, well, I could make you a woman. And Adam says, well, what's that? And God says, well, she's a very beautiful creature. She would make you laugh and smile. She would cook your meals, and she would do your laundry and give you children, and she would be loyal and faithful for the rest of her life. And Adam says, wow, that's great. How much would it cost me? And God says, an arm and a leg. And Adam goes, well, what can you give me for a rib?
That's a terrible joke.
Everybody loves that joke.
The second story, however, again, going back to Haydn, the oratory of the creation ends with this lovely duet of Adam and Eve singing, we're in this garden, and where God has created us to love each other and enjoy Him forever, and it's this lovely duet, and it kind of ends on this like minor chord or something. We know what's coming. We know what's coming. And what is coming is that God has placed two trees in the middle of the garden. One is a tree of life, and the other is a tree of death. In other words, what is the essence of human existence is at the center of human existence is moral choice. We have to choose between life and death. And what is in order to eat of the tree of life, we have to learn the two great lessons of life. One, there is a God, and two, He's not you. But in the moment that we choose, as the serpent tempts us to say, you can be like God, and you get to decide what's good and bad from your point of view. And as soon as we can make that moral choice, what happens? We plunge, we lose the sense of the presence of God, we are driven from God's presence, we discover that the world is full of thorns and hardship and cruelty. We become, our eyes are opened in the sense that each of us becomes an object of desire to the other, and our lives become ruled by desire and oppression not forever. If it would be forever, we would have had to have eaten of that tree of the fruit of life and lived forever. But God in His mercy expelled us from the garden, and He sets about a plan to how can I win these people back? How can Darth Vader be redeemed? What follows after Genesis 3 with the story of Adam and Eve are the sort of consequences of that choice. First thing, Adam and Eve have learned in their initial choice shame in their relationship. They cover themselves with fig leaves and so forth, as each has become an object of the other's self-gratification. Then the next is that there is a class warfare in the story of Cain and Abel. Cain is a shepherd. I got that right. Cain is no, it's the other way around. Abel is the shepherd and Cain is the farmer, right? And so Cain kills Abel, and there's the emergence of class warfare. And then in the consequence is of this continuing the continuing sort of reverberations of the initial choice is that the whole creation is sort of plunged back into chaos, which is the story of the flood. The order that was brought about by God's creation is unraveling. And what I think about as a way of illustrating this is the internet. Some of you are old enough to remember the first days of the internet. Do you remember that?
Mm.
I mean, things were free. You could download programs. They didn't cost you anything. People shared. It was all just this wonderful, pristine creation. And somebody created a virus. And somebody started charging for the programs. And somebody started, you know, getting in, stealing. And now you got to watch your back. You got to protect yourself against identity theft. You got to do all of these things as the creation itself has just plunged and fallen into this. And you don't have to do anything. You just are born into that world. That's what we mean by original sin and by the fall of the whole creation. In Genesis in 10, you get the story of the table of nations that the races emerge after the flood. Mankind is now divided into these different racial groups, and then and one of the racial groups is going to be a slave of the other, and then the next you get a table of nations, and then the nations start. There's the emergence of nationalism and empire building and the building of the Tower of Babel and all of that, and God confuses the languages, and the whole thing is just a mess. But
Still is.
we have made the transition from myth into history. And God called one man, Abraham, or Abram, and he says, go from your country and your kindred to a land that I will show you, and I will make you to become a father of many nations, so that all who bless you, I will bless, and through a descendant of yours, all the nations of the world will be blessed. That's the start. God, the name Abraham means father of the nations, and it's God's beginning of a process of getting Adam back to. And then you have from Genesis 12, which is where that occurs, all the way to the end of Genesis, the great stories that I hope you're all familiar with, of Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and what we call the ancestors of fathers, and Sarah, his wife, because God promises that through a descendant. Now, these are not heroes, these ancestors. You know, if you read the Greek drama, you'll find stories of Achilles and stories of Ulysses and stories of Ajax and the great heroes of the Trojan War and so forth. These are ordinary people. They're faithless and sometimes mistrusting, conniving. They're ambitious and all of those kinds of, and yet through it all, God's promise is being kept. And eventually, the children of Israel. I'll just have to pause a minute. How much time have I got to do this? So get rid of prophets. Whatever I did with
It's-
mine.
35 after.
Yeah.
35 after. There it is. So, who is Israel? Israel's real name is Jacob. Jacob is the second son of Isaac. According to the way things ought to work, the blessing of Isaac ought to fall on his eldest son. His name is Esau. But Jacob is mama's boy, and his mama wants the best for Jacob. So when Esau is out, like a man, I said last week, killing, the hunting and gathering, for the family, Jacob is hanging around the tent, and his mother says, "Your dad's dying. Put on a fleece so you look like, so when he touches you, you can't see very well. When he touches you, he's going to think you're his brother, and then you're your brother. He's your Anyway,
Yeah, we
you got
know.
it? You get what happened?
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, so Jacob does, he goes in. And the way they thought about a blessing is if a blessing, it goes forth, you see. And once it goes forth, you can't call it back. So Jacob sneaks in and gets the blessing that should have gone to Esau, but it goes to him. Then Esau comes in and he's famished because he's been out hunting, and he says to Jacob, give me some of that porridge you're making. And Jacob says, well, I'll give it to you if you'll send me your birthright. So he says, what good's that to me now? Sure, you can have it. So then he goes into his father and he says, here, I'm Esau, bless me. And he says, oh, I already gave your blessing to Jacob. Do you like Jacob? Sneaky little kid, right?
No.
Naughty mom.
But one day, one night, he's out and the angel of God comes down and he wrestles with him all night long. And when the dawn breaks, the angel says, you gotta let me go. And he says, I won't let you go until you bless me. And he says, okay, here's the blessing. Your name will no longer be Jacob. From now on, you're gonna be Israel, the man who fights with God.
Oh.
Pretty good, huh? So the next time in the middle of the night you find yourself wrestling with God, don't let him go until he blesses you. So the people go down and they eventually, through famine and all this story of Joseph into slavery in Egypt, they become a great people in terms of numbers. The Egyptians treat them harshly. They probably are building pyramids and all of that without much food. And they cry out to God for a deliverer. And the only one that God can find who will listen to him is Moses, who is, I told you his story before. You know, he has killed an Egyptian, and then he sees two Israelites fighting because his mother had taught him those are his real people. And so he tries to break up the fight, and they say, you're gonna kill us like you killed the Egyptians. So he flees off into the desert, marries a local girl, starts going to work for his father-in-law. Doesn't get much worse, let me tell you. And one day, there's the burning bush, and God speaks to him when he says, I'll see this bush that was why it's burning and not consumed. And God says, I've heard the cry of my people. I've come down to deliver them. And he saves them out of slavery by bringing them across the dry land of the Red Sea. I always thought that was probably a legend or mythological until not Ian, the one before. Irma came by, and I watched people walking across Tampa Bay.
Oh.
Did you see that? You know, they literally, the wind had blown, a strong east wind blew all night long. Tampa Bay was blown out into the Gulf, and people walked across it on dry ground,
Oh my gosh.
and then it came back.
Sounds like
So,
a tsunami.
But anyway, the point is that a little band of Hebrew slaves escaped from the greatest power of the earth, and they got across to the other side of this immense barrier that should have been impossible. And they looked back and they said, we couldn't have done this. God must have done it. They learned everything they knew about God from that experience. They learned that God was a God of mercy and compassion and justice. He had heard the cry of his people. He came down to deliver them. They learned that he hates oppression and that will bring them to freedom. They learned that he is faithful to his promise. They learned that he can act in history, and they learned that, and then they were brought to Mount Sinai, where they were given a covenant or contract, and the contract was, I'll be God and you'll be my people. Which is the reversal of what Adam had said, right? Adam had said, I'll get to be God and I'll decide. And God said, no, here's the contract. I'll be God, you be people, and then love one another. Or you must love your neighbor as yourself. The neighbor, by the way, is not the, it's not your family. It's not the people of your tribe. It's not your homies, right? It's the person who's next to you, the person whose oak tree you've been trying to get him to trim all year long. And when the hurricane comes, it falls on your roof and you have to get, speaking from experience. So that's, I think maybe that's it, isn't it? What time we got now, Nicholas? Few minutes?
Yeah, you can finish.
Oh yeah, it's only 10:41, I
Yeah,
got
finish
plenty of time, okay. Is this coherent enough? I know I'm covering a lot, is it still coherent? Okay. So, after some time of wandering in the wilderness, the people of Israel finally enter the promised land and they encounter the gods of, it's a transition from being, shepherds and wanderers to nomadic peoples into a settled agricultural life. And so they encounter the gods of the agricultural life. And some of them begin to think that the old gods of the Exodus are really kind of passé, old-fashioned, and that since we've got this new life, we need new gods. And the new gods are called Baals. They're the word just means lords, but they're fertility gods. So the basic metaphor is that there's a father sky god who rains his seed down upon Mother Earth, and Mother Earth becomes fruitful and multiplies, and the flocks and the herds increase and their crops grow, and you have prosperity. Where's justice in that? Not matter, doesn't, it's not, God didn't, the gods don't care anything about justice. They just want sacrifice. You offer them something, maybe you can stimulate them to action by offering them a virgin daughter or by engaging in cultic prostitution. The word orgy and the word liturgy have the same root. Did you know that? And and this is true not only in Mesopotamia, but also in the Greek mystery religions as well, the Dionysian cult and so forth, that there was that kind of we're reading the book of Hosea today at this time in our Tuesday morning Bible study, and God sets up a kind of a metaphor for Israel's relationship to God. He says to Hosea, in effect, you want to know what it's like to be me? I'll tell you what it's like to be me. You go out and marry a prostitute. And not just marry her, have children by her. And not just marry her and have children by her, but you've got to deeply love her. And every time she is unfaithful to you, every time she plays the whore and runs away with, as she's a cultic prostitute herself, she's participates in the Baal worships as a cultic priestess. Every time she is faithless to you and plays the whore, you've got to take her back. You've got to plead with her to come back. And every time she breaks your heart again, you've got to plead with her, God. And that's what it's like that's what it's like to be me. Still want to be God? Still want to be God? Anybody know the Jackson Browne song, Here Come Those Tears Again? I hear your footsteps coming down the hall. I don't know if I can, I don't know if I can open it up again to let you in. But that's what God says to Hosea's got to do over and over and over again. In fact, the prophets we heard one of them today, Isaiah's Song of the Vineyard. in the Old Testament lesson. You can see the continuity between that lesson and Jesus' teaching, right, in the gospel, the way they're paired up. Because it's a, keep in mind, this is written probably, what, 750, something like that BC, which is probably before Homer. It's probably 300 years or so before Aeschylus and Euripides and the great Greek poets. I'm gonna take a minute on that. Because God has saved you from slavery, you must not wrong a stranger or oppress him, because you were slaves in the land of Egypt. God desires mercy, not sacrifice. You are to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So the prophet stands up at a wedding feast, perhaps, maybe the wedding of the king. Let me propose a toast for my beloved, my king. My beloved had a vineyard. You know the Robert Burns, my love is like a red, red rose. Well, my beloved had a vineyard, and he nurtured the vineyard, and he cared for the vineyard. And he expected that it would bring forth fruit and be faithful. He looked, now here's where the poetry gets wonderful. He looked for grapes, Hebrew sorek, but instead he got sarak, sour grapes. He looked for grapes. What else could he have done? So here's what he's going to do. He's going to tear down the wall. He's not going to protect anymore. And he's going to rip up the vines, and he's going to let it be destroyed, because the house of Israel is the Lord's pleasant planting. And he looked for justice, but instead bloodshed. And here again, I got to give you the Hebrew. He looked for righteousness, but behold a cry. He looked for mishpat, justice, but instead he got mishpat. So close, so different. He looked for tzedakah, but behold sa'ak. Spit it out. So here's what so then Jesus takes that story up. Let me tell you a story about a guy who had a vineyard. What is everybody going to hear? Uh-oh, we know what's coming on this one. So he had a vineyard, and this time he moved away to a foreign country, but he sent people to collect the fruits. What's the fruit? Justice, righteousness. What do they get? They take him and they kill the one messenger, kill the other one, stone one, kill the other one. So what's he going to do? He's going to tear down the wall of that vineyard and give it to somebody else who will really take care of it. And the priests say, they perceived that he had told this against them. Maybe stupid, but maybe slow, but they ain't dumb. So there's this continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And yet there's this sense, as you finish the prophets and you read the last of the Old Testament, there's a sense of incompleteness. Jerusalem was in fact conquered. Israel was in fact conquered. The people were carried off into slavery. Everything that the prophet said had come true, and yet there's a sense that it's not finished. And so the Old Testament doesn't end just as a book of judgment. There will be a day of the Lord. Now the prophets have said, woe to you who desire a day of the Lord. It's going to be a day of darkness and not light. As if a man ran from a bear and put his hand in the window and got a snake. But there will be a day of the Lord, the prophets say. But in that day, God will send a Messiah or a son or his special anointed one, and he will make a new covenant, which won't be like the covenant that they broke. when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, but he'll make a new covenant with them, and it won't be based on law, it'll be based on forgiveness. And then he'll pour out his spirit on them. Dead will be raised, and God will make a new beginning. Let me see, are there other expectations? God will be the judge of his own people. He will save his people. He himself will come to save them. God will make a new covenant with them. He will give them a new heart and a new spirit, not like the heart of stone that they have now, but a heart of flesh. He will establish his kingdom. His word would accomplish his purpose. It'll go forth to accomplish what he wants. He will forgive their sins. He will raise the dead. He will pour out his spirit on all flesh. He will begin a new creation. He would act through a man who would be a prophet like Moses, or a servant of the Lord, who would suffer for his people, and yet would be God's own son, the Son of Man. And that will be the beginning of the new creation. You can't, it's not an essay. You're not going to find all of that in an essay form, but those different, it doesn't even, you can't even figure out how they'll all work together. I mean, how can he be one like a Son of Man who comes on clouds of glory, and on the other hand, be this suffering servant who suffers who dies and suffers, who's despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted. How does all that fit together? I don't know. There's just a sense of hope at the end, a sense that the judgment has come and the promise is yet to be fulfilled. We were, how then should we live? Any of that, is it still holding together? Anything I need to still? Okay.
So, Father, can I
Yes, absolutely.
ask a quick question?
Thank you.
So after all that, the day of the Lord, and they predict that the coming of the Son of Man is going to be
Son of
Lord.
God.
Son of God. I
Mhm.
keep saying the Son of Man, Son of God.
There are two different predictions. The Son of Man comes from the book of Daniel, and Daniel is brought before or sees an image of the Ancient of Days sitting. It's like a vision. It's a night vision, and he sees the image of God as a enthroned on glory, and then all the nations are brought before him. First is a beast of iron, and then different metals, and then finally one like a Son of Man comes, and to him is given power and dominion and glory, and his kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. The Son of God image comes from 2 Samuel, when Nathan the prophet says, or rather when God tells Nathan the prophet, go tell the king, you don't need to build me a house, I'll build you a house, and I will raise up a son after you, and he will be. So the Son of David and the Son of God kind of link up, but this other figure, the Son of Man, is different. And that's part of the problem, is they don't look like they fit together at all. And then there's the other prophecy. But anyway, I interrupted you. Go
No,
ahead.
but that's the question from your book. It says it was not easy to see how they could ever refer to a single man or event. So I guess that's what you're saying.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah. And then you throw in another one, which comes mainly out of the prophet Isaiah, but it refers back to Moses. Moses was supposed to be the humblest man who ever lived, and he was a servant of the Lord, So how does that fit with this majestic heavenly figure? Or how does that fit with the Son of God or Son of David who will inherit the kingdom? And, what does it mean for him to bring his people out of slavery? And so all these expectations, in the end, by the end, I mean by New Testament times, when John the Baptist sends, and this is leaking over into next week's story when I tell the story of Jesus, but when John the Baptist sends his disciples, he's in prison and he sends his disciples, And his question is, are you the one who is to come? See, they've just kind of conflated all those different expectations into, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for somebody else?
So are we sure we have the right guy then?
Good question.
Yeah.
Good question. The answer that, for example, I've heard rabbis give is no, we don't have the right guy. Because the right guy is supposed to establish Israel forever, you know. And you look around you, what's going on in between Hamas and Israel today, you know. But as we understand the story ourselves, now we say, oh yeah, that's what he meant. You know, we didn't understand it at the time. So you can't take that element out of the story. I don't think you quote Elvis Costello, put it all down to fate, but you still got the chance to choose. You know, ultimately you have to. I heard a bishop, my bishop in Southeast Florida used to. He told a story one time. He had been bishop of Honduras before he was elected in Southeast Florida, and he told a story one day of these children that he saw fighting in the streets and so forth. And he ended the story by saying, now you could say, and he gave some kind of cynical explanation of what had happened. He said, but I choose to believe. And I thought, that's an interesting phrase, isn't it? You know, in the end, you have to choose. You know, Jesus says, whoever has eyes to see, let him see. Whoever has ears to hear, let him. In the end, you know, I mean, I've heard rabbis say, no, you got the wrong guy.
Yeah, I'm not questioning it. I
No,
I
that's
believe in
fine.
the Son of God. I believe that he rose, and I believe in God. But it's like the more I read, the more information I get, the more questions I have.
Then you have to choose.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. So we've already accomplished one goal, right? Faith is seeking, not having, right?
Choose.
Okay, folks. I know we didn't get to everybody's, let's see what we have here. Yeah, we didn't get to hear any stories today. Next week, I hope we'll get to hear those of you who didn't. Stay with it. I know it was a lot, and you probably have lots and lots of questions. I have given some biblical references by chapter mainly and book for you to check out if you want to know more. But, and if you have some questions that you really want an answer to, next week, raise your hand before we get started, and I'll try to respond to them. Or you can write me an email or call me on the phone. Okay.
What do we read for next week?
Well, I'm going to be telling chapter 3. You can read anything you want, but I'm going to be talking to chapter 3.
Jesus.